Hi everyone, so thank you everyone for coming. We just are absolutely overwhelmed by the fact that you all want to be engaged in this conversation with us, so thank you. I'll be talking about inclusion versus integration as showing different perspectives of placing children with special educational needs in a mainstream setting. So let's start. Let's start with integration. So, understandings of inclusion and integration have been granted in individuals' needs and rights. And this understandings impact on teachers' own conceptualizations of both concepts and also on their professional practice. In the UK, the framework of integration has been granted in a Warnock report from 1978, which is concerned with understanding of the physical placement of the child in a mainstream setting, the exposure to social interaction and the practicality that is associated with participation of children in some kind of selective activities. This framework encourages of placing the children in, and I quote, less restricted environments, okay, namely in the mainstream education. However, the successful placement of the children in such environments does depend on the complexity of children's needs and also the ability to adapt to the mainstream environment. Okay, so the successful integration here depends on children's capacity to fit within our mainstream environment. Okay. On contrary, inclusion, as defined by the Centre Code of Practice, and I quote, is protection from discrimination from disabled people, and the UK government is committed to inclusive education of disabled children and young people, and the progressive removal of barriers to learning and participation in mainstream education. So that's big words here. And supporters of education would argue that all individuals, regardless their race, ethnicity, cultural background, individual differences or disabilities, have the right, if they feel they want to have this right, to be a full member of the wider society and wider community. And this participation relates to all aspects of life, including education. So inclusion in this sense embraces individuals with special or extra needs on an equality basis. And it is understood as a positive social value. However, different working definitions provide very different interpretations, obviously, and guidance that have implications for professional practice. And this impact directly on the expectations, the attitudes and the beliefs of teachers, practitioners, parents and autistic individuals themselves. And then in UK, the Centre Code of Practice serves as a first point of reference in respect of inclusion terminology. It has also been promoted as a key point of reference for all teachers and practitioners working with SEN children, including autistic children, in the mainstream provisions. Okay, I'm going to skip one slide because I know I'm talking too long later. So I just want to talk a little bit about including the voices of children and young people with ASD in a mainstream setting, because they were very often excluded from the context, and those people are the people who are very much the central attention of what we're talking about. So the children diagnosed with ASD who are included in mainstream education are often directly exposed to the complexity of a day-to-day school dynamic, which may challenge their ability to cope. It is already recognized that those with special educational needs are more likely to be bullied at schools. And also, in addition, the difficulties of communication and interaction experienced by those with autism place them at even higher risk. They may lack the resilience to help them overcome the problems, and actually the thought of school can become a very distressing concept itself. And also this increases the level of social isolation. For many, order and predictability appears to be as a kind of security blanket that allows them to function, and trying to maintain this in a very noisy and dysfunctional and chaotic environment of the mainstream education, it proves to be very difficult for many. Some students refer to the visibility of additional support in a mainstream setting that makes them feel they are different and they cannot succeed on their own. And for some, any level of disclosure of the diagnosis was seen as a barrier to the ability to be seen or considered as normal, whatever normal means. So children with ASD sometimes have actually desire to educate others about the fact, how they feel and see, and how they experience their own being in a mainstream setting. So that they very keen actually to educate themselves as well. Well, the thing is, when diversity becomes the norm, students feel more able to embrace the challenges and also the opportunities on a mainstream setting. And sometimes actually the contrary. It is often the assumptions of practitioners and teachers that if a child with ASD is academically able, he or she is going to be able to cope in a mainstream setting, which is not true. Well, let's see a little bit more about parents' voices and see what they think about mainstream ASD. The teachers are generally supportive of inclusive the parents are overly satisfied with some aspects of inclusion and integration of the children in the mainstream setting, and in particular with regards to the opportunities of the social interaction within and beyond the school setting, and also the children's full acceptance by the typically developing peers as well. However, the parents' confidence diminishes as the children enter secondary schools very often, and it is during this time when they are at the increased risk of developing mental health problems. And these experiences should be examined as a direct impact of professional practices in the mainstream education, and also as a direct impact of the policies, and that they don't consider the particularities and characteristics of autism. And I will refer here to behaviour for learning policies in secondary mainstream education. But what teachers say about including children with ASD in their own mainstream classrooms. The teachers are generally supportive of inclusive and integrated practices in their classrooms. And the SEND Code of Practice being as the first point of reference and a legal guidance for practitioners and for the teachers in supporting children and young adults with SEL, including autism, in educational setting, requires the making of, and I quote, reasonable adjustments in the interest of removing barriers to learning. Okay? This is open to significant variations in interpretation. What reasonable means for one person means very, very different thing for another person. Therefore, the teachers consider the terminology used in the document to be very ambiguous. The teachers support generally inclusion and integration, and they know this beneficial for the children, especially in regards to social interaction with others, the exposure to some of the social situations. However, the lack of measurable tools for professionals and personal evaluation for staff and a tight framework proves to be very challenging on a day-to-day basis. Most teachers do not feel sufficiently supported to meet ASD's children's needs. teachers felt that there's not good enough ASD training available for them, and the quantity and quality of support staff limited the learning opportunities for the children. Some teachers communicate the need for semi-inclusive settings, and here I refer to some ASD-based resources attached to the mainstream provisions, which are becoming more and more popular, I think. And some teachers are also concerned about the potential impact of challenging behavior on others in a classroom. Right. I just want to leave you with this quote of policies and behavior, okay? And I read it out and we're going to discuss it a little bit further. So, public experts in behavior tell us to write lists of rules, make sure children are punished before they are rewarded, exclude disruptive children to protect the learning of others. There's often little in the way of objective assessment of a child's needs, and interventions are being based on guesses about the deficits. There's a limited repertoire, anger management, ASD-type problems, signs of ADHD. There's nothing new here. We've done the same thing for decades and failed to make a difference. It clearly doesn't work, and maybe things have even got worse, and that's from Guardian 2014. I want to talk a little bit about the exclusions, because that's a direct impact of what actually this quote meant. So, well, behaviour is a national problem in schools in UK for many young people with and without disabilities. And this has set the platform for behaviour policy scrutiny adaptations. However, children with hidden disorders are in the highest risk of temporary or permanent exclusion from mainstream settings. And I just wanted to quote a few things from a study conducted by Ambitious about Autism in 2013. 4 in 10 children had been subject to informal and therefore illegal exclusions. 1 in 10 parents whose children were illegally excluded said it happened on a daily basis. And I can actually add that exclusions from schools based on a disability grounds is not legal. Nearly a third of parents reported being asked by schools to keep their children at home. Itself is a form of illegal exclusion. A fifth of parents said the child with autism had been formally excluded from schools. Over half of parents had kept their child out of school for fear that school was unable to provide appropriate support. It is based. Well, is full inclusion a possibility at all? And again, I'm going to leave you with that quote and ask you for your own reflections. I'm going to read that quote. So, requiring schools to compete as if they are supermarket chains treats children as commodities and leads to pressure on schools to select their intake and increase pupil exclusions. So that's who Kevin Carpenter, Joint General Secretary for the National Education Union, said in Guardian very recently. And I leave that with you for your consideration and reflection. Thank you very much.
Damian Milton, can you hear us? And Damian will talk to us about the growing empathy problem, implications for practice. Dr. Milton is an author, consultant, lecturing in intellectual and developmental disability at the Tizard Centre at the University of Kent, and he's also chair of the Participatory Autism Research Collective, known as PARC. Over to you. And I will agitate a piece of paper at some point.
Hello everyone. A little bit about myself. I'm on the autistic spectrum myself. I was diagnosed 10 years ago with Asperger's, as it was known then. And this was following my son's diagnosis a few years before. My son was diagnosed at the age of 2, and he's now 16 years old and up here. And he's also got severe learning disabilities, whilst I was diagnosed at the age of 36, so a bit of a gap there. This title slide is a bit of a cheap plug. I had a book out a couple of years ago, kind of collection of some of my work, and goes into more depth in some of the topics I'm going to be talking about today. Starting off with a quote from old Hans Asperger. This is not one of his finer moments. And this is, I'm highlighting this because I disagree with it very strongly. But I think it had this kind of idea had a long-lasting negative impact that's still going quite strong. The autist is only himself and is not an active member of a greater organism which he is influenced by and which he influences constantly. What he's getting at there is autistic people aren't really full members of society, that they're not fully socialised into society or influencing it back. As if autistic people were machine-like, not fully social beings. And he's quite incorrect in that. And this has developed over the years, but a dominant theory often used these days is so-called deficit in theory of mind, or the ability to empathise with others and imagine their thoughts and feelings in order to comprehend and predict the behaviour of others. These quotes here were taken some years ago when I was analysing some data for the Autism Education Trust. These quotes are from autistic young children with the average age of 10.5. 95% of people don't understand me. Friends are overwhelming. Adults never leave me alone. And most worrying me of all, adults don't stop bullying me. If you look at these quotes, okay, they're from more verbal autistic children. There's certainly a social awareness being shown there, and an understanding of self and other, and that other people think differently to oneself. What's perhaps a bit different for an average 10-year-old are some of these comments. Maybe from a later teenager you might consider these a bit more standard perhaps. But there's certainly social disjuncture and problems with interactions with other people. Friends are overwhelming, where the boundaries between friendships lie, and so on. That top quote, 95% of people don't understand me. These kinds of quotes come up far more regularly when you look at the accounts of autistic people than about problems trying to work out what other people think or theory of mind difficulties. And some years ago I called this the double empathy problem, because it was a problem for both parties, not just the autistic person. A case of mutual incomprehension, as it were. A breakdown in interaction between autistic and non-autistic people is not solely located in the mind of the autistic person. So in this theory, it's largely due to differing perspectives of people trying to interact with one another. with a theory of autistic mind, if you like, often leaving a great deal to be desired. One example I use to highlight this is the old Two Ronnies sketch, Four Candles. And I would suggest looking back over it, because the Ronnie Barker character coming in with his shopping list, to me is somewhat a caricature of an autistic person. And the shopkeeper, played by Ronnie Corbett, is more of a non-autistic person. And with this clash in understandings, the shopkeeper gets more and more irate as the scene continues. And it's because by empathising with the other person, if he was acting in that way, he'd be winding him up, it'd be a kind of taking the mick. And so that's why he was getting annoyed. So this kind of empathy was projecting falsehoods into the other. And the subtext of a social situation is never given, as it were. It's actively created by people in context. And when empathy is applied towards an autistic person, it can often be wildly inaccurate in its measure. One of the things or theories that I think is closely related here and works alongside is those of Dinah Murray and Wen Lawson and others, in what's called an interest model of autism, or monotropism. And this suggests that attention is a scarce resource, so you only have a certain amount of attention to give at any one time. And so I can flick this pen here, I've just found, and carry on talking to you at the same time. But if someone threw a tennis ball at my head at this very moment, I'd probably be in trouble. So you only got so much attention at one time. If you consider a sensory processing world which is more attuned to the here and now rather than prior experience, that has potentially problems integrating lots of information if it's coming in all at once, then how you use your attention might be affected by that. You might block off attention into certain things in order to concentrate on what is predictable or controllable in a scene, or what's of interest to someone, and giving positive feedback. And as this moves through time, it can lead to a spiky profile, an uneven set of abilities with a few intense interests where you get a lot of joy and positive stuff back from, and a whole lot of avoidances of things that didn't work out so well. But this kind of way of being can lead to quite idiosyncratic patterns. So what the likes and dislikes of one autistic person will be might be the complete opposite of the next autistic person, and so on. But much social skill and behavioural training with autistic people is predicated upon breaking down social information into explicit information, which does little to actually help autistic people adjust to the changing flux of negotiated social reality. Because social reality sometimes cannot be made simple and explicit or rule-bound. I often hear this kind of autistic people can't read the unwritten social rules. Well, if it was a rule, then write it down. If it's flexible and changeable, it's not a rule.
Yeah.
So, recently, however, methods such as intensive interaction focus on relationship building, child and interest-led activities, and I think I've got a lot of time for that as a practice I do. And it's challenging some of the dominance within the field, how best to help people. So I've got a couple of quotes to finish with. This is an early quote from a pioneer of autistic self-advocacy, Jim Sinclair, in the early 90s. Grant me the dignity of meeting me on my own terms. Recognise that we are equally alien to each other, that my ways of being are not merely damaged versions of yours. Question your assumptions, define your terms. Work with me to build bridges between us. This double empathy idea has been talked about in so many words as long back as autistic people have been writing their accounts. This was a quote from an article from Asperger United magazine, I did an analysis of for one study, and this was a quote from that. When I'm in an environment I feel comfortable in, with people who are kind and tolerant and doing things I enjoy, then I am as happy as the next person. It is when people tell me I should think, speak or behave differently that I start to feel different, upset, isolated and worthless. So surely the problem is a lack of fit with the environment rather than something inside my brain that needs to be fixed. Thank you.
Taken a different route. I hope it's okay. Yes. So, I'll introduce myself because although I said I was sharing tonight, I didn't say who I was. I'm Dr. Lita Crociani-Windland. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of the West of England. I work in sociology and psychosocial studies. I'm also chair of a US-based association for psychoanalysis, culture and society, and form part of the advisors committee for the Association for Psychosocial Studies. So that's really psychosocial studies, but don't tell. Okay, so I thought I would actually start to tell you a story. And I suppose the title of the story could be, Why Am I Here to Talk to You About Transition? I hope it will become clear that it's actually quite strongly autobiographical, but I hope it's not too much information. It's more about trying to tell you why I'm here before I go on to transitions. So, my youngest sister was Down syndrome, and she sadly died of leukemia when she was still a child. She was 8, and she is a major influence in my life. She is responsible for much that has happened since. She has to be thanked for making me love children and for helping me recognize the importance of good provision for vulnerable people of all ages. When she and I were growing up in Italy, there was little on offer by way of education for special needs. In Genoa, then a city of the Italian industrial triangle and counting a million inhabitants, there was only one special school with a long waiting list, or what I can only describe in the kindest way I can think of as a parking space, a warehouse, where children could be left to their own devices to allow parents to work or have respite. My mother could not tolerate to see children left to rot for hours to the sound of blaring music in a vast empty hall. She refused to take my sister there. She read about Montessori and summer hill provision elsewhere, and devised picture cards and other ways to home educate my sister. She was ahead of culture and structures in the Italian society of that time. She was adamant that my sister was capable of learning, even if it might take longer and need more help, and that she had a right to education. At the time, village schools had more discretion than city schools, and eventually her solution was to get my sister to attend a small primary school in the village where my paternal grandparents lived and where we spent every school holiday. I believe it was the face-to-face community of village life that allowed something to happen that couldn't happen in the city. The local school already had a Downs girl a bit older than my sister attending. The village had always accepted that disability could be a part of the life of any family, and despite this being felt as a very difficult and or stigmatizing event, overall it was a more benign, safe and accepting environment. I believe this is a difference in relational quality, which links to what Damian was saying, that actually was facilitated by the proximity and familiarity of the village setting. I started then my working life teaching early years, and as time passed I started to notice more children in my class had special needs. I wanted to do right by them, but in order to do that, I felt I needed to understand more about different kinds of special needs. This and other circumstances led me to a change of career, and I moved to working in a residential specialist college for 16 to 25-year-olds with learning difficulties and disabilities. The residential nature of the work meant that I was not only teaching, but also living with students in our care. The setting was campus-based with classes in the morning and work training in craft workshops and kitchens in the afternoon for the younger ones. Moving to work training focus all day for the older ones. There were plenty of cultural activities, games, and a homely environment which created a rich and safe environment for our students, which comprised of a mix of young people with moderate to severe and sometimes complex learning difficulties. The ethos of the place was strongly inclusive, in spite of it being a very sheltered environment with only around 30 students and a core staff and young volunteers all living together on campus. In a sense, what I had somehow managed to find again was a village community that did not look down on people's special needs and tried to meet each person on their terms, whether student or worker. But why am I telling you all this? Well, it's not by way of confessional, although it could be taken that way, but actually to show how lived experience actually can be quite enriching and really give expertise, if you like, from practice. Okay? You don't have to be an academic, and I haven't been always an academic. But I wanted, after a certain point, to really understand more about the complexity of the social setting, the political, the policy aspects, and that was partly why I'm here now. But I worked with many students before I got to where I am at UWE on the autistic spectrum, and I love the work. Increasingly, however, I found that my seniority in the work was taking me away from them and more into the management of increasing paperwork. A combination of the drive towards integration and care in the community, rather than inclusion, meant specialist provision was seen in terms of segregation, isolation, as in the bad old days I had lived through with my sister. And the idea of inclusion was being equated to having everyone under the same roof, ignoring the barriers that a large comprehensive of FE college might create for students on the autistic spectrum in particular. This also started to combine with a tightening of resources that saw the period of funding for FE transition to adult provision and or employment shrink from 16 to 25 as the age range that the funding was available for to a standard 2 years with few exceptions. Barely enough for the student to adjust to one setting and gain confidence before moving on to another. So transition and then transition. So this is what brings me to the theme of transition itself. which was in fact the focus of where I worked. We tried to really cater for that transitional period between child to adult. And there are a number of dimensions, I think, that I learned from practice. So what makes for a good transition to adulthood and employability, in my experience, is that where learning difficulties and disabilities are involved, people may need longer to develop independence, and that this may vary from individual to individual, and it should not be rushed. And that the level of independence that can be achieved may not be absolute. But that does not mean that there is no value to what the person can contribute, or that they do not gain from being able to contribute to society. And these first two points that I'm making are difficult in relation to current policies and the times of austerity and uncertainty that we have experienced, particularly recently. From an academic point of view, I'm not the only one to think that in spite of efforts to provide more holistic and person-centered policies, the current system sees paid employment as the ultimate goal of all education. But this may not be appropriate or realistic in a world where many are suffering from the increasing demands of paid work anyway. Work, being occupied in a meaningful and real way, is part of what makes us human and is important, but not just in terms of its economic value. It is about feeling useful in whatever way that can be achieved. One of my ex-students is now in his early 40s. He was a shy and fearful 16-year-old when I first met him. And over time he has learned many skills he can now deploy in his work in a cafe, which he is very, very proud of. But it is not less a source of pride for him that he now leads the local Ramblers Association walks. And I get a regular phone call where he tells me which walks they've done, which were the longest, and how it all worked out when he was leading those. So all of his meaningful activity development took time to achieve. But I've lost my place. More time than is now allowed. He managed to actually have more time in a period of transition to adulthood so that he could develop those skills before being thrown into an adult world of work. And it seems to me that the investment paid off in the long term, and that short-termism is another critique of current arrangements, in my view. What also helped was time away from his family. I say this with all respect for families and without underestimating the challenges involved. I've been in a family with a person with a disability. Again, from direct experience, I learned that, as with all our children, it is hard for them to be motivated to take on tasks and responsibilities without a break from the family setting. Personally, I couldn't believe my son telling me over the phone after moving, to university into his own flat, that he noticed, never mind clean, the windows. That was like, what happened? Did he have a personality transplant? So, but also that we as parents may find it hard to let go of our children and see them as adults. In other words, transition is linked to relational aspects. It's not just them that have to grow up. We have to grow up as parents to let them grow up. So transition means letting go of something to embrace something new. With young children, it might mean sucking a tongue to let go of the actual breast, having a teddy bear to manage separation for short periods of time, rehearsing through play actual situations they will need to encounter as they grow up. For young people with special needs, it may mean having sheltered environments for periods of transition, where work is real and useful, but where the pressure of performance and efficiency is not at the forefront. there has to be room for mistakes, getting it wrong. And for people with autism, and I'm talking probably here about the more severe learning difficulties end of the spectrum, a setting that will not cause undue distress and stress is even more important. It's not easy to find in our very performance-driven workplaces, though there is more appreciation of this at times, thanks to campaigning and some useful and informative, sensitive programs. Career services have a place. We used to have connections, and now there is a new form of career service that is coming with the latest reforms about education, care and health planning. But that needs investment, it needs training. And Aga also mentioned that, sometimes in education training, teacher training, there isn't enough being offered to those students in relation to disability issues. I know this, again, from personal experience. My stepdaughter started teaching and she had a severely autistic child in her class and she ended up phoning me. But, there were plenty of colleagues in the school. So, I'm going to leave it there, but just with one thing that I think is absolutely key is that there should be alliance rather than division between the people who are there caring about, and not just for, people with disabilities. So parents, services, and everyone else. It shouldn't be just one or two people who have to marry or make an adjustment. So it's in that spirit that we actually were thinking about this event. And it's in that spirit that I hand over to you to contribute. We have a roving mic. So it's over there. So if you put your hand up, it should